Right. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this auspicious event. We have here Mr. David Starkey, who I'm sure most of you know. I will briefly introduce him. He is a former fellow of Fitzwilliam College here and of the London School of Economics. For a good 3 decades now, his historical documentaries are very much a sort of a centrepiece of Middle England culture and so on and so forth. My grandmother's very jealous of me tonight, by the way, David.
Give her my love, as one normally says at these moments, yes.
No, of course, for the last couple of years he has been taking some gardening leave, a subject which I'm sure will come up and I'm sure you will want to ask him about. But for the time being, he's going to start by giving us a talk on his conversion to conservatism, which of course in these circles is rather like throwing red meat to wild dogs. Everybody loves a convert. So, David, I shall pass over to you for 15 or 20 minutes.
If you will forgive me for standing, it's a terrible habit of former university teachers. I will endeavour not to speak for 50 minutes. I'm sure you will shut me up. My friend Matthew Paris, and we still remain so despite much of his recent deplorable pro-Remain behaviour, has the lovely line that the problem is not coming out as gay, but coming out as conservative. And casting my mind back to my days in this place from 1964, I was not a member of QCA. I would have been appalled to think that I was speaking here. And what I've had is not exactly a Damascene conversion, it's a series of shifts. And I want to explore with you some of these shifts this evening very quickly in terms of chronology, but then to ask a more fundamental question: why have they happened? And I suppose it's really that I became let's do the chronology very, very quickly. My background, my parental and home background was very modest. I was the child of a manual worker and a woman who had been a cotton weaver. They were born in Oldham. They had to move to Kendal in the Depression of the 30s. I was born in Kendal. My grandfather came to live with us at the beginning of the Second World War, and the result was I grew up right from my earliest memories, which go back very early indeed, in a household that was politically triangular. My father was almost a Corbynite in terms of Quaker, pacifist, internationalist, exactly the kind of person that has enabled Putin to happen, as simple as that. My grandfather, who came to live with us, had joined up in the First World War when he was in his 30s with 3 children and was a passionate Lancashire conservative. He must have been one of those who voted for Churchill, who first represents Oldham as a conservative. It's his first seat. My mother was a Liberal. So I grew up with a little debating chamber of my own in my parents' home. I wasn't particularly political. I was interested. I was again force-fed on The Guardian, the Manchester Guardian as it then was, both at home and even in the Quaker meeting. I don't know whether any of you are familiar with the Society of Friends. In theory, you speak in meeting only when you're moved by the Holy Spirit. It was very striking in the Kendal meeting, and it has become still more so, that the Holy Spirit reads the Manchester Guardian. That every single remark in meeting is directly a quote from The Guardian. And when I teased my English master, because I was quite satirical even then, who was also a member of the meeting, he gave me one of the best put-downs that I ever had. You were called by your surname in those days. "Ah, Starkey," he said, "you don't understand. The Holy Spirit writes The Guardian." Right. So that was the world I was brought up in. And it coloured me. First time I was able to vote in those days, of course, you could only vote at age 21. I voted Labour really without much thinking about it. And then, of course, there came the great crisis of the Heath years, of the Barber boom, of the extraordinary. Never has there been a more comprehensively mismanaged government than that. with spectacular, appalling consequences. We talk about property prices now. Do you realise in 1972 to 73, property prices rose by 3 times. 3 times in a single year. We were on the very verge of Latin American style inflation. It was quite extraordinary. When he asked the famous election, who governs the country, I had a single answer, not you, mate. And I voted, remembering my mother, Liberal. And then there was the conversion of the late 70s, the horror of the governments of the 70s, the 79, the winter of shame, the winter of discontent, and all the rest of it. And I decided at that point, never, ever would I vote Labour, ever, ever again. So I became a voting Conservative. But I had no notion, and I think this is generally true of the Conservative Party. I mean, there is a famous remark that socialism is what the Labour Party says it is. That is even more true, generally speaking, of conservatism. I suppose if I had to characterise myself intellectually, that would be giving a very grand name to it, it would have been the standard Thatcherite position. In other words, if you defined yourself in reasonably coherent terms, you would say that you were a Manchester School liberal. You were liberal in terms of both economics and increasingly, and of course again, I need to put into the picture my involvement. It's very hard to realise, isn't it? I was one of the pioneers of gay rights in this country. I had been carefully written out of the script for very, very obvious reasons. But going right back, Gay Lib first comes in the very beginning of the 70s here. I went off to London and to misbehave from this place after having exhausted the pleasures of the university bathing place. I went off to London, and we had this wonderful early slogan of Gay Lib, better blatant than latent, which I endeavoured to live up to comprehensively. So I was liberal on the two sides. And my position was always that I was in quest of a political party that would share my general liberalism, because as we all know, social liberalism has tended to go to the left, used to go to the left in politics, and economic liberalism to the right. Nevertheless, I found in general a reasonably happy home within certain sections of the Conservative Party. And when I became, I suppose, best known in terms of commentary on current affairs, you're all far too young to remember it, but in the 1990s with the Moral Maze, my position within the debate there, which I described, I think, rather nicely as intellectual tag wrestling, my position there was that of a thoroughgoing libertarian, to take that as the basic position. And it served me quite well, until I realised I didn't actually believe it, and that I was profoundly dissatisfied by it. And whenever conservatism is reduced either to Manchester School liberalism, which far too much of it is now. When you just talk of freedom of speech, freedom of trade, the free market, capitalism and whatever, as Scruton points out eloquently and forcefully, that has absolutely nothing save accidentally to do with conservatism. That seems to me to be fundamental and axiomatic. It simply doesn't. Why did I become discontent? What did I feel was going wrong with that position which I'd adopted, the combination of social and economic liberalism and its culmination in libertarianism? What did I feel was wrong? I suppose, and I'm now going to have to ask you to be indulgent, and this is not a rhetorical device. I'm going to say things this evening that I've never said publicly before. And they're going to be the sort of things that, again, as a hardened atheist, I find rather difficult to say. I think we've got to encounter the fact that politics is not fundamentally rational. It is not fundamentally rational. nor are we as human beings. Liberalism, libertarianism, are the culmination of a narrow, shallow, and ultimately self-destructive rationalism. That seems to me to be axiomatic. They are shallow and they are self-destructive. They are necessary. The destruction is sometimes, a certain degree of quizzicalness is necessary. But the shallowness, the failure to recognize that there is something beyond reason and that reason itself can be and very often is destructive. That perception, it's an intimation, which is why, as I said, I think it's fundamentally religious. And the way in which, it's religious in, I'm using that as a very loose term. I have absolutely no belief in God. I do not believe, and again, the foundation of conservatism in its roots in Toryism is God and church. It's church and king. That's exactly what it is. A belief in divine right and whatever, all of which seem to me to be preposterous and absurd. They do not touch me. So what is it when I talk about the failure of rationalism, when I start to use what is almost a language of extrasensory? We were talking at the beginning just now, when I came into the room and I asked for a lectern. I said I wanted the lectern because I wanted occasionally to be quoting poetry. And the poetry, of course, as I'm sure some of you will now beginning to think, is going to be Eliot. And it's Eliot in Little Gidding. Some asked me, had I ever filmed in Little Gidding? I said yes. And one of the great compliments that used to be paid to me in the days when I used to receive compliments rather than brickbats was that I was very good at bringing history alive. Have you ever thought what a strange statement that is? Because history is dead. The historian, by definition, spends his time with the dead. He spends his time as much with the dead as a gravedigger or a mortician. Happily, they're usually in fresher condition. You know, the gruesome bits have been dealt with. So what on earth do you mean when you say you bring it alive? What I think it means is you have a sort of numinous experience. And you communicate that numinous experience in which the dead peculiarly become the living, which is why I said it's quasi-religious, it's resurrectionary. And let me just read the most famous lines from Little Gidding. They're very short. So when the light fails on a winter's afternoon in a secluded chapel, history is now and England. And it's this sense of connectivity, of time past, of time present, and time future, which it seems to me has to be the essential ground of serious conservatism. And everybody here now surely is realizing that what I am doing is trying to do Burke in poetry. And it's no accident whatever that Edmund Burke's greatest essay is actually on the sublime. He is essentially an aesthetician. And the bits, and there are very few bits actually, of the reflections on the revolution in France that are worth reading. Most of it is, hands up everybody who's read it. Isn't it tedious? Page after page on Assigna. Page after page on the minute geographical descriptions, the circumscriptions, the actual geographical areas of France in the Ancien Régime and France in the very early stages of the Reformation, exactly another revolution, of the reverting to my 16th century history of the revolution. What is it that enables also Burke to become prophetic? Because remember again, not only are there these extraordinary bits in that essay, not only are these extraordinary bits in which the language suddenly goes Empyrean, it becomes electrifying, becomes extraordinary, but it's also absolutely prophetic. It is written, remember, when there's been the march on Versailles and the royal family have been brought, and there's been the murder of some members of the royal guard, and they've been forced marched back to Paris, but none of the horrors have happened, and yet he prophesies them all. How is there this quality of, on the one hand, these passages of astonishing political poetry, is I think what I want to call them, and at the same time of political prophecy? Again, this is Vatic. This is not the normal work of a political theoretician. When you read Burke, you are not reading political philosophy. You are reading prophecy. He is actually draped in the mantle of prophecy. And what he does, of course, he grasps exactly the point that I made at the beginning. What are the limitations of reason? The whole central attack in the reflections on the French Revolution is on reason gone mad. But the identification with the self, the mere solipsism, the realization of the self by saying that all that matters is what I want, is, he realizes, will lead to madness, will lead to disintegration, will lead to rupture, will lead to violence, will lead, in fact, to the end simply of civilization. And those two great passages, the one contrasting France, the sense of the rape of a country, as prefigured in his sense of the mistreatment of the Queen, the mistreatment of Marie Antoinette, on the one hand, and then the juxtaposition with the image of the great English oak and the calm cattle browsing beneath it, barely disturbed by the chattering crickets of liberal intellectuals. And I suppose what happened in various ways and at various moments, now I'm sounding very Eliot, in various ways and at various moments, was that in the filming, in my history, in my own writing, the things that I was doing, a whole series of things came together to give me this sense of a kind of numinous anchor. If you, for example, you look at the man who was seen, rightly, as being the person who was most tried, who began with my perception of his perception of the inadequacy, the self-destructiveness of liberalism and rationalism and libertarianism and everything else, Roger Scruton. When you look at his attempt at anchoring conservatism, it is profoundly unsuccessful. What he essentially tries to do is to root it within an Hegelian tradition. And it becomes terribly near to state worship. If you actually look, in a bizarre sense, if you actually look at the central passage in the Philosophy of Right, where this entire absurd synthetic rhetoric of the dialectic, the neo-Trinitarian rhetoric of the dialectic, when that dissolves away, you're left with that central passage, which is really, I love Big Brother. I really love the Prussian king. Now, I don't think that works. I think it recognizes one absolutely fundamental thing, which is, again, as I said, that our politics are not a matter of choice. Our sense of self, our language, our political culture are all inherited. They are not contractual, unless it is the contract, which of course, as Burke redefines it, the point that I'm constantly making, the contract of the living, the dead, and those yet to come. No sillier statement has ever been written than Rousseau, that man is born free. Man isn't born free. As St. Augustine put it rather bluntly, he's born midst piss and shit. And he has to be washed and fed, and even she has to be washed and fed and tended for the next 3 years of their life, 3-4 years of their lives. We are social products. And it is this, it seems to me, that is the serious basis for a proper foundation for conservatism. It is a recognition of your anchorage in your own culture. I'm afraid the conservative has to be specific. There is no such thing as a universal human nature. There are no such things as universal human rights. There is no such thing as international law. There are specific, which is why, of course, the whole of the neocon enterprise has been so absolutely catastrophic. There is instead, our experiences are profoundly local, and they're culturally rooted. This doesn't mean that they're racially or any of that nonsense. They are culturally. People can acquire a culture. People usually born in a place acquire a culture. And this seems to me to be the essential point. And what I've tried to give you that sense of intimation, of numinousness. And I'd like now just to end by pulling out some quotations and then finishing with what I hope will be a profoundly controversial Cambridge reference. I suppose this sense of the creativity of the old was brought home to me most powerfully, way back in the 70s, when I first started writing about literature in the context of history. And it's one of the great quotes from Chaucer, who, remember, invents English. We all know this, don't we? English is an invented language. It is an extremely modern language. It does not go back beyond about 1390 in any serious sense. And right at the beginning of the enterprise of the invention of English, and right at the beginning of the enterprise of what we call the Renaissance, Chaucer, in the Parliament of Fowls, comes up with this astonishing quatrain. Out of old fields, as men saith, cometh all this new corn from year to year. And out of old books in good faith cometh all this new science that men learn. The old is not dead. The old is fructifying, is created, produces the new. Burke we've already referred to, the contract of the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. Scruton, I mentioned a little. I want to throw in quickly the idea of Disraeli, the man who is, of course, the founder of the real Conservative Party. Disraeli, at his best, is the sharpest practicing political thinker of 19th century England. And he does two things which I think are really striking. The first is he identifies liberalism as the enemy. He has the absolute laser sense of liberalism as the enemy because it is culturally and politically and in every other respect destructive. He equally again recognizes that that does not mean that you say there is to be no change at all. And in the great Free Trade Hall speech after the Reform Act of 1867, which is the one, of course, in which there's the great throw of the dice, in which will it turn out that the working class is right-wing or left-wing, and they turn out, quite a lot of them, to be, like my grandfather, to be happily right-wing. Disraeli comes up with this extraordinary formula. Yes, we have change, but the change must be commensurate and sympathetic to the character of the people. In other words, the old has to accommodate the new. The new adjusts to the old. There's an extraordinary reciprocity of the two. And finally, there's that sense of the chapel, that sense of Eliot, that sense of Little Gidding. And it's very political. Let me just read this quickly. If I think again of this place and of people not wholly commendable, not immediate kin or of kindness, but of some peculiar genius, all touched by a common genius, united in the strife which divided them. If I think of a king at nightfall, of 3 men and more on the scaffold, and a few who died forgotten in other places here and abroad, and of one who died blind and quiet, why should we celebrate these dead men more than the dying? It is not to ring the bell backwards, nor it is an incantation to summon the spectre of a rose. We cannot revive old factions. We cannot restore old policies or follow an antique drum. These men and those who opposed them and those whom they opposed accept the constitution of silence and are folded into a single party. Whatever we inherit from the fortunate, we have taken from the defeated. And what have they to leave us? A symbol perfected in death, and all shall be well, etc. In other words, we are the inhabitants, the inheritors of a common past, of all of those conflicts in our past, which, rather wonderfully around Trafalgar Square and at one end of Whitehall you find the statue of Charles I, and at the other end of Whitehall you find the statue of the man who beheaded him, of Cromwell. There's that kind of literal exemplification that I've been talking about there. Cambridge, I'm afraid, is now engaged in the precise catastrophic reversal of that process. If in this university, surrounded by the buildings that one is, reaping the culture that is present here, the libraries, the beauty, the gardens, if one cannot understand that common rootedness of past, present and future, you are lost. Well, I'm afraid Jesus College is lost. What is going on at the moment in the attempt at removing the Rustat Memorial in Jesus is exactly the rupture of that bond. Why does this university, why do these colleges exist? Precisely because they exemplify that Burkean formula of past and present and future. But what does the master, whom I'm ashamed to say comes from William, what does the master, what does Sonita Allain say? It comes down to whether, this is the removal of the Rustat Memorial, it comes down to whether it's in the best interests of our current and future students for this celebratory memorial to be in the chapel. That is the rupture. It is a rupture, and it is one, if it is allowed to happen, that is disastrous. What is worst of all, it's been endorsed by a man who should be at the centre of this national tradition, the Archbishop of Canterbury, the infinitely failing figure of Welby, the man who celebrated Holy Communion during lockdown in front of a kitchen cabinet. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that powerful talk. I'd like to start by talking about what you said about the incompatibility of liberalism, of neoliberalism and conservatism.
Liberalism, full stop.
Liberalism, full stop. And your observations on Disraeli and conservatism. You spoke about your working class upbringing. Of course, one of the tools in the arsenal of Disraeli, which he used to attract working class voters, one of the things which he added to the pre-existing sacred cows of Toryism, like the crown and the church and so on, is nationalism, which for him was articulated through empire building, the imperial cult of the Queen and so on and so forth. And a lot of these, and obviously that stirred a lot of instincts in those days, which it can still stir, but for various reasons, both practical and moral, empire is no longer a sort of viable activation of those instincts. So and neither is church going, for instance, which we were debating here just last night, and a whole rafter of other things which used to be completely banal in this country and in other societies. So my question is, how do you activate these instincts which you identify as irrational but fundamentally good? How do you do it now?
Well, Disraeli uses empire and inventing Victoria as Empress of India. He uses them merely as current devices. What he's saying essentially is it's patriotism. And I think that there is still, it may be inchoate, it's sometimes brutal, it's sometimes Ingerland stuff, but that's right. And again, if I may suddenly, after Ingerland, suddenly become very academic, the period of history that I'm particularly interested in, the 16th century, of course, invents the idea of a national church. And it does so by an astonishing switch from an essentially Platonic mode of approach to religion to an Aristotelian one. In other words, from the general to the specific. And there is this remarkable, as it were, and I'm I'm not in any way saying that I endorse this as an interpretation of Christianity, but it's a very striking thought. If you look at the propaganda that is put out by Henry VIII's minions in the late 30s, 1540s, when war, the possibility of England, it's a bit like, the world that we were in after the Brexit vote, when you're the pariah state faced with the possibility of a European Union. You actually get this idea that the specificity of God's providence, which has you born in England, means that you have a divinely ordained duty to be English. And I think that sense of place, of locality, of belonging, of your own, is still it's there. Again, it's the point that was made with with David Goodhart's tremendous distinction between the somewheres and the anywheres. It's the basis of the Brexit vote, because what you've had is a kind of hypostatization of liberalism with the new internationalism, a kind of universal globalized governing class that speak the language that all entertain each other at Davos, and simply can't believe that anybody, be it a Brexiteer or Putin, believes anything different. So I think that, and this is surely what David Frost is on about, that simply daring to say you have a first duty to your country. The reason we're contemplating the catastrophe that's unfolding around us now is we've lost sight of that simple responsibility. We no longer have the first duty of the state is to protect you. And it's to protect you against external, both internal and external enemies. And we are largely abandoning that notion. And this seems to me to run counter to everything that actually most sane and sensible people think. There's been this shift, the sense that somehow, that not only is patriotism not enough, that the patriotism is actually somehow a bad thing. This is deranged. Absolutely deranged. And so again, you see, I think when you were saying the whole business of going to church, what was the Church of England? I mean, shall I again be a little modestly provocative and say that the important thing about the Church of England for most of its history is that its connection with Christianity was entirely accidental. There is the catastrophe of Ramsay in the 1960s, who rediscovers Christianity, and the church has collapsed ever since. The Church of England was English Shinto. It was the English worshipping themselves through the monarch. And as it seems to me, that is an entirely rational activity. Particularly if you contrast them with the French. Again, another good formula is all bad ideas are French, which is why you define conservative. I'm being deadly serious under the humour, which is why you identify conservatism by way of opposition to French thought. The catastrophe, the biggest catastrophe in human history is the French Revolution. It is the only reason that the horrors of the 20th century happened. It is spawned by the horror of the French Revolution, and the direct father of the French Revolution is the disorder of European thought that is based in Rousseau. Everything that we call cultural Marxism, postmodernism, everything else flows directly from the disaster of Rousseau. And it's essentially onanistic thought.
As Sir Humphrey says in Yes Minister when discussing the Church of England, the Queen is essential to the Church of England and God is what they call an optional extra.
That's absolutely right.
No, but of course...
Alas, that used to be the case.
If I can try to make this relevant to the events of the last couple of days, of course, when we see Mr. Putin talking about the invasion of Ukraine, he does not talk about contemporary geopolitical considerations. He talks about a religion which is a proper religion, and about Kiev as the capital of the Russian Orthodox faith. It's where the bones of St. Vladimir are located, and so on and so forth. And therefore, union is imperative from his perspective. Given what you've been saying tonight, are you in any way sympathetic, not empathetic, but sympathetic to this, to what he's trying to do?
Yeah, what I try, I've made a YouTube video on the subject, plug. I think we need to take Putin seriously. This notion that Putin is mad, this ludicrous business of psychologizing everybody that you disagree with. Putin simply has a different set of values from ours. But you see, he is talking not as I've been talking. He's not talking about a nation. He's talking about the restoration of an empire. That is fundamentally very different. But of course, you said empire is dead. Well, I'm sorry, Sam. Empire is dead if you belong to a dead empire like ours, or a dying empire like America. It is exceedingly alive if you belong to a reviving empire like China, utterly, deliberately, consciously imperial, or to an empire that's, either going to go out, in some great explosion like Russia, or quasi-revive itself. So remember, imperialism is intrinsic in human history. The reason that the Spanish were able to conquer Latin America with a tiny number of troops, the reason that Clive was able to conquer India, they were conquering empires. They were decapitating empires. That's exactly why you were able to construct the thing in the way you were. But Putin is doing something different. Putin, he's using the same body of ideas. Of course he is. Of course he is. But he is using it in an imperialistic context. I'm not. We have, again, bring it home to us all. Contrast what we are doing now, the lives we are living now, with the experience of those people in Kiev. I had my birthday dinner with one of them. We talked about her refurbishing her kitchen, modelled on mine. Why are we so secure? Why are they so insecure? It is our history. It is the astonishing stability of our politics, which has been able, say, with that violent rupture of the 16th and 17th century, to absorb change within pre-existing structures. Now, I think we're at a terribly dangerous point in which it's at last looking as though the new wine in the old bottles might actually burst them. But for 800 years, we have had that broad continuity of political structures which gives us, and social structures, which gives us what we are. Again, look at the history of 19th century England, Disraeli and all the rest of them, and contrast it with continental Europe. Continental Europe, the only way there could be change was by tearing down and tearing apart and revolution. Here, those who want political representation don't campaign to dethrone Parliament, they campaign to become part of Parliament. And it's an absolutely, these are boringly obvious things to say, but we simply seem to have forgotten that the boringly obvious is usually right.
Going back.
Shall we throw things open?
Yes, we can throw things open if you like to. Questions?
No, I just think that it's proper. You can have me at dinner, or have me for dinner indeed if you wish.
This is right. Let's go over there.
So England at the current time is quite clearly a multicultural nation. Are there any common strains left among the people of England, and if so, what are they?
You see, I don't think England is multicultural. I think that this is an entire misapprehension. I don't believe that we have this series of separates, this fashionable word, silos. I think, in fact, almost all immigrants to England are bicultural. Can I tell you a little bit about the famous video, right, that led to me being ripped apart and my denunciation as a racist? If it's available, I have no idea whether it is or not, have a look at it. What I'm doing mostly in that video is talking about my idea of biculturalism. Because in the same way that Disraeli is profoundly aware of the vast, large economic changes of the 19th century, of course, as a sensitive historian, observing my own time, I'm aware of these gigantic shifts in the composition of our population. And I've already referred to my experiences in the moral maze. And for me, one of the most profound, mostly it was just fun and a bit of tag wrestling and some wonderful memories. Did anybody here ever listen to The Moral Maze? It's supposed to be serious discussion. Well, there was an element, but there was a marvellously provocative producer. And as Michael Burt would be going on air, and you would listen to this as the solemn, I would think of Radio 4 listeners as being a little bit solemn. Did you remember P.J. O'Rourke's definition of solemnity? It's what happens when stupidity goes to college. But anyway, isn't it just so wonderful? Anyway, Michael would be going, oh, David, now really you're going too far. What Michael didn't know was behind his back, the producer in the booth, a man called David Coombs, would be vast-mouthed gestures. Get the fucker, David, get the fucker. So the programme was really quite exciting. But there was this extraordinary on- and off-screen relationship, as it were, with Hugo Gryn, the liberal rabbi. And there was a wonderful moment on air when Hugo said to me, he spoke down here, one of these kind of voices that accounts to prostate cancer, right down, which alas he died of. And Hugo, David, you're not half as nasty as you seem. David, trilling lightly. And you, Hugo, my dear, are not half as nice either. Anyway, but Hugo did something quite extraordinary. He invited me and my then partner to a Passover. And I have never been as moved in my life. And here was this man who was major at that point, really significant public figure in Britain, absolutely part of this world of British politics, became a Jewish priest. The head of the household is a priest. Now, Jews have exemplified this extraordinary, apart from the Hasidic, this extraordinary biculturalism. I think the same is true if you look at Rishi Sunak, if you look at virtually all of the members of the cabinet, if you look at most of our Chinese community, there's this extraordinary ease in moving. The great problem has been, and the reason that I said what I did, was that there's a certain section of the leaders of the black community which have decided, and of course it's an absurd thing to talk about all these communities as though they were uniform groups, but has decided to say they're not really British at all, they belong to America, where there has indeed been this terrible cultural clash. I don't think we need it in England. I want to talk about biculturalism. In other words, but that of course entails something else, that we have to acknowledge there is a dominant culture. But that dominant culture shifts and changes. Of course it does. Why is curry our national dish? Why do we wear pyjamas? Why do we live in bungalows? Because of the old empire and the new. Because again, there is this problem of defining conservatism as simply stopping change. Disraeli nails that instantly. But it has to be change of a certain type. I mean, the example of what goes wrong when you have change of the wrong type is what happened with the Blair government, which is our nearest to the French Revolution. That sense of, now I'm being semi-serious. The adoption of the notion of the year one, of taking of new sacred, debunking historical texts like Linda Colley's rather silly book on Britons, or still worse, whatever was the man who was the expert on Poland and decided he would write on Britain. Anyway, the changes that Blair introduced, like, for example, the creation of a Supreme Court, the demotion of the office of Lord Chancellor, these are exactly changes that are corresponding to abstract rationalism. This, again, these absurd, whenever the French write about England, they get it so badly wrong. The catastrophic work of Montesquieu, this notion of the separation of powers, which of course is a grotesque parody of the English Constitution. The English Constitution works because there is no separation of powers. The executive sits in the legislative, which is the only reason Parliament lasts. Parliaments have to be managed. And the catastrophe of Blair was, of course, that you say, oh, but this doesn't correspond to Montesquieu. So we've got to separate out the Supreme Court from Parliament, and we can't have Lord Chancellors because they're both political and whatever. And the culmination of that is the absurd, the preposterous, the illegal decision of the Supreme Court on prorogation, which unilaterally abrogates the Bill of Rights. I mean, this is what happens when you do the wrong sort of change rather than the right sort of change.
Over there, just the first hand. Yes, you.
What would you say is the single most fundamental thing that makes the Tory party so electorally successful in the UK?
What is the thing that makes it, well, one of the things that makes it electorally successful is, of course, it's completely protean. It can, if you like, it has an amoeba-like quality or indeed, nowadays I suppose it's more like that octopus quality. I mean, an octopus can fit down a tiny little tube. There's an element of that, but I think finally it's Disraeli's perception that we are a naturally conservative people. I'm sorry, I don't think there's an accident that there has been this kind of party. And also again, of course it cuts across all the descendant countries from England who've adopted a broad, relatively stable party system. And when the party system has become unstable, as in Canada, you have had the most appalling consequences called Trudeau. I think that conservatism again, the different schools can lead to within the same party figures as disparate as Macmillan and as Thatcher, an appeal that goes from the home counties to, as I said, my grandfather in Oldham, we become lazy. We fail to think of some of the challenges that there are now. We need a serious rhetoric. We need, dare I say it, serious thought. We need another Disraeli. I had some hope. I mean, if you look back to Boris's election, to that election, the electoral coalition is spectacularly similar to that is engineered in the wake of Disraeli in the late 19th century Tory governments. I mean, it's astonishingly similar. Because remember, this notion that the North was always Labour ain't true, any more than Scotland was always Labour. And Boris looked as though, again, on the subject of essentially, I mean, I don't believe that Brexit was fundamentally anything more than saying we are patriotic. The fundamental heart of the notion of patriotism as it's developed itself in the English-speaking world is the right of a people to self-government. I don't think it's any more than that. I don't think it's rabid xenophobia. I don't think it's hatred of our neighbours across the Channel, though some of their subsequent behaviour would have justified it. And what Boris was able to do, what Cummings was able to do, was to put together that Disraelian coalition. Now, how you keep it together, and my view is that the only way you can do it is by what is now if we're to deal with the self-belief of China, if we're to deal with the self-belief of Russia or the manufactured self-belief of Putin, however far we think it has a resonance, this neo-Tsarism, this neo-orthodoxy has a resonance within Russia, we are going to have to rediscover self-belief ourselves. Otherwise, we're lost. If we spend the whole of our time, like Sonia Allain, fussing about the flaws in our past without realizing that the slave and the slaveholder in the depth of time are one. The idea that those wonderful lines in Eliot, that there is that reconciliation in time, and that a healthy culture is capable of that reconciliation. Now, it sounds, when I touch that topic, but is it any more than the experience of a boy like myself, who was the child of the father that I was, who, because of 8 years of unemployment in the 1930s, and the unspeakable poverty that entailed, when, because of an absurd diagnosis, he was told to have his teeth out, he had them out without an anaesthetic to save half a crown, 12.5 pence. Right? Now, how on the back of that could I be a conservative? Exactly because of what I was talking about. That sense of time as a reconciliator. And if we're instead going to look at our history simply as a subject to revive those party distinctions, to revive, perpetuate and intensify them, we're lost. That extraordinary ability that we've had as a nation, finally to absorb and reconcile. As I said, I really do think we ought to look at it seriously. Round Trafalgar Square, you have James II, whom we dethrone, you have Charles I, whom we behead, and we have Oliver Cromwell, the man who is responsible finally for the destruction of both of them. It is simply extraordinary, isn't it? That there they all are. We haven't felt the need to purge our past.
Shall we have another one? Emily.
So if I might bring it back to conservatism and liberalism, what you said is so interesting, and it really reflects, I think, a similar debate that's going on among American conservatives about how can you reconcile these two things. And it's particularly tricky for Americans because for us, liberalism is in fact our tradition. I mean, it is what gave birth to us. And it seems to be that liberalism is a kind of check upon conservatism to keep it from becoming power-hungry and totalitarian. So what exactly does it look like to take this idea of irreconcilability between them and put it into policy? I mean, how do you keep from becoming acute?
Well, I mean, let's be quite truthful. What Disraeli was saying was, if you're a conservative, the liberals are your enemy. He actually thought that, I think, in a more general sense, but he was aware, if you like, that the two-party system, at its best, is a sort of cultural dialogue between those who want change faster and those who want to keep things more or less as they are. And the two-party system properly within a satisfactory constitution can achieve that balance. I mean, Disraeli again saying, Disraeli actually uses the word progressive in the Free Trade Hall speech. In a progressive society, change is necessary, change is constant. The issue is how it's done. Now, America, of course, does have a terrible problem, which is the folly of Jefferson and the Jeffersonian element in both the Declaration and to a much less extent in the Constitution. One of the reasons why you've been able to why the 1619 Project has been able to probe America so brutally is that in the Declaration you actually adopt these absurd generalist statements about the universality of man. But of course, when it actually came to the actual practice of drawing up the Constitution, you did no such thing. Very sensibly. Why is America the only successful revolution? Because you could put forward, discuss. This is in the days when there was a scholarship exam, which used to be called the Tripos and Promise. This was the kind of question you said. Why is America the only successful revolution? Because it only, in theory, espouses these preposterous universalist doctrines, and instead it is fundamentally grounded on social and legal and every other kind of continuity with the English colonial experience. I mean, that's, if you actually look at the American Constitution, it is the most light emendation of the real Constitution of 18th century England. I mean, are you an American? right, can I tease you? What is the person who is the presiding officer of the House of Representatives called? The Speaker. Why is she called the Speaker? Because the presiding officer of the House of Commons is called the Speaker. What is the administrative officer of the House of Representatives called? Anybody? The Sergeant at Arms. Why the hell is he called the Sergeant at Arms? The Americans haven't the faintest idea what a Sergeant at Arms is, because there was a Sergeant at Arms who was assigned to the Speaker in the English Parliament. You know, so you have all of this absurd fancy dress of universal rights and Roman draperies applied to what is basically a working version of the English Constitution. But it creates this terrible tension between the actuality of the situation in the 1770s, 80s and 90s and this absurd universalist neo-French structure that was glued on it, which is why they've come apart so terribly. And of course it leaves Americans peculiarly prone to a belief in universalism. The catastrophes, it's no accident that the catastrophes of the League of Nations and of the United Nations are essentially American confections. Discuss.
Any more for any more? Who have we got? Right at the back there.
Yes, sorry. You speak a lot about this notion of a Church of England in which God is not an expert. But when exactly in history would you place this atheistic or agnostic, not caring Church of England? When was it?
I think bits of it, there are bits of it there much of the time. It becomes, I'm being naughty, of course, and simplifying disgracefully. It's particularly true of the 20s, the 30s, the moment of the real God, I can't get the word out. Putting ceremony back into the English monarchy, which follows the reign of, which is the fundamental contribution of the reign of George V. And it's that, and that stretch seems to me, again, I'm not talking about there are figures profoundly moved by faith. I am fully aware of it. I'm fully aware of the vast tensions utterly driven by the belief of God of the 19th century church. But so much of the formal church, its place, for example, you look at Victoria's coronation, you look at the church in its public role, then it seems to me, or even more, dare I say it, the church for much of the 18th century. I mean, the church whose music and vigour is driven by Handel. I mean, the text of the Handel oratorios, they seem to me to be they are the equivalent of the war song of the Japanese army. If you actually, God is a man of war. I was just listening to the Israelites in Egypt last night, and this is the material. So, of course, there is no such thing as the Church of England. There are several churches, rival, conflicting, mutually in mutual hatred. I'm talking about largely the role of the church in its national framework of public ceremony. I would guess in most parishes. Am I wrong?
What about most parishes?
But am I wrong that there has been clearly the only way that this thread of a national church actually survived? I mean, the first effect of Henry VIII's creation of the national church is, of course, on the one hand, enormously to project royal power, and then, of course, to lead to a century and a half of the most intense religious struggle. And at the end of that, in 1689, you get this broad Erastian settlement. What I'm fundamentally saying is that the church is essentially Erastian. And this is also the point that's made actually at the height of the Civil War, you will remember, when the Scots, another problem nation, briefly impose Presbyterianism on the English. Leslie, the Scottish representative in London, writes back to Edinburgh and says, they've only pretended this is a lame Erastian presbytery. And it seems to me that this, a church whose faith is determined by Parliament has to be a church of essentially the description that I give. It's the constitution of the Church of England until the role of Parliament was abandoned in the wake of Runcie, determines that it is as I describe it. You get all sorts of tensions and debates and whatever, but that, I would argue, is the continuing thread, the only reason that it survived, and the removal of that hand of the state, the removal of that Erastian control, will be why it dies and reduces itself to a series of warring sects and factions, which is manifestly what's happening to it now.
We're overrunning slightly. With your permission, David, we'll take one more.
Yep. Yeah.
I was just asking, how would you explain the sort of reformist zeal of runaway liberalism that you describe, and the fact that Britain is an increasingly old and decrepit and aging society?
Well, it seems to me that if you actually look, it's very boring when old people like me sort of say, in my experience. But if you actually look at the moral revolution which Britain has undergone since the 60s, I was brought up in a world where the mere notion that I might be homosexual ruptured almost completely my relations with my mother. I'm now in a world now where it's practically compulsory. I'm being serious. And of course, it's faintly old-fashioned because we should all be transsexual. I mean, the fact that, if you think of 1950s England, the fact that we're convulsing ourselves on the right of people to, genetically modify, well, not genetically, medically modify themselves from one sex to another, or one gender to another, whatever. Think of what that transformation is. If you look at the subjects of public debate, if you look at the notion, the fact that we had coastguards saying, actually, we can't stop immigrant boats because they might drown. Can you imagine what 1950s England would have done to the to those immigrant boats? They would have been turned back. And if people drowned, well, I think, we had politically in England, we had a very weak 1960s. In terms of its broader consequences, I think they have been staggering, quite staggering. The proliferation of welfare. Do we all know actually how much of the budget how much state expenditure is devoted to the three things of the NHS, the old age pension and welfare? What percentage of the budget?
90%.
Pardon?
90%.
It's well over 80%. All other activities of state are reduced to the teens. Nobody even the welfare state, the two great moments, the one under Lloyd George and the Labour Party in 1945, the founders had no conception. And again, the revolution in the notion of what the state should do, the vanishing of the army, the navy. You try to think again, if you don't believe me, how many of you watched the film of the coronation? Far too few of you. Look at that and see the world that represents and contrast it with what it will be like if there is another coronation. No, I really do think that we have undergone, without the forms of revolution, we've undergone the most extraordinary change. Partly, of course, it's been by a process of cultural penetration. In other words, if you actually think of the takeover, say, of institutions like the British Academy or large sections of the high academic elite like Oxford and Cambridge, if you think of somebody like Gopal actually being a fellow of a Cambridge college and a professor at Cambridge, the idea is deranged. In the world that I grew up. I think it's deranged anyway, but if you compare it with the world that I grew up in, the fact that these absurd posturing jargons will be taken seriously as academic disciplines. You know, something very big has happened, which is why I really do think we need to read. So the purpose of all of this was to act as a little bit, not as a kind of, dare I say it, conservative evangelical. I do think we need to start evangelizing. Otherwise, there will be nothing to conserve. There really won't.
I think that's the perfect note to wrap up on. Thank you, David, for coming to speak to us tonight. It has been such a privilege, and it's been a fascinating evening. So if we can all show our appreciation to David once more.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.